Good afternoon. Welcome to the Library of Virginia. I'm Dennis Clark. I'm the librarian of Virginia, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's lecture on the history of the Pamunkey Indian Tribe's involvement in the American Civil War. Most Americans have heard of the history of Pocahontas and John Smith, but few have learned about the rich history of Virginians' Indian communities beyond the colonial period. This lecture will provide insight into why the Pamunkey chose to support the Union during the war and what roles they played. Before I turn the microphone over to our distinguished speaker, I'd like a chance to share a few upcoming events at the Library of Virginia with you. On Friday, April 26th in the afternoon at 5:15, please join us to celebrate the discovery of order books from the J. Henry Brown Monuments Company in Richmond. Grave markers, as you may know, are a significant source of historical information for families, for researchers, and genealogists. The Library of Virginia previously preserved 12 volumes of order books from the Brown Monuments Company. Recently, 14 previously unknown volumes were uncovered, spanning from 1928 to 1958. These volumes are now a part of our collection, and together they offered an unparalleled view of grave markers across the region. And also, on April 27th, from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., the Library of Virginia is heading out your way, if your way is the Eastern Shore, with our LVA on the go in the Eastern Shore Public Library. And you can, of course, view our calendar of events online to get details for these and any other upcoming programs at the library. Lastly, we would like to give your feedback on today's program. We have evaluation cards on the table in the lobby when you leave, and we would appreciate it if you would fill them out as they give us valuable information on how to make this program and other programs better and more engaging. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ashley Spivey. Dr. Spivey is a historical and economic anthropologist specializing in the archaeology and culture of the Powhatan Algonquin communities located in Tidewater, Virginia. Dr. Spivey's academic and professional experience has centered on the tribal cultural resource management and tribal historic preservation. She has worked with the tribes, universities, museums, and federal and state agencies to implement historic preservation and cultural resource management programs. As a member of the Pamunkey Indian Tribe, Dr. Spivey has a close connection to the Virginia Indian community. This has included directing the NAGPRA and Section 106 NHPA consultations, developing cultural heritage and cultural management strategies, facilitating administrative capacity building through consultation on program development and implementation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ashley Spivey to the podium.
Thank you for the introductions. Good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to see how many folks are here at a noon lecture and program. So thank you. So I'm excited to see that. And I'm really excited to share this very, it's not a small snippet, but it's a snippet of time in Pamunkey history that very, very few people know about. And it is my honor and my privilege to be here today to share this history and these stories and this knowledge with you all. So before I kind of delve in, I just want to give you an overview of what to expect when we're talking about Pamunkey Indians, the engagement in the Civil War. So I want to open up to you all who are the Pamunkey, right? So I'm going to actually start hundreds of years before the Civil War so that folks can get an understanding of who the Pamunkey are and how we kind of fit within the larger history of what became the Commonwealth of Virginia. And then I really want to focus in on the social, political, and economic environment that the tribal communities in Virginia faced leading up to the Civil War, which very much inspired their decisions to support the Union when the Civil War began. And I also want to bring home how dangerous that decision was for tribal communities. Pamunkey was not the only tribe in Virginia that supported the Union. The Chickahominy were one of those as well. And there is more research that needs to be done. That's the other thing I want to emphasize here, that this is just the tip of the iceberg of the history of Indigenous engagement in the Civil War in Virginia. So there's a lot more to be done, and I hope to do more and expand upon this presentation as I continue my research. And last thing, I've got some nuggets kind of sprinkled throughout the presentation where I have quotes from Pamunkey tribal members who were interrogated and interviewed when they were attempting to get funding for the property that was taken during the Civil War. And so it's a very rare historical document that we have access to that allows you to actually hear, right, see the words of Pamunkey people who experienced the Civil War. And so I have those quotes kind of sprinkled throughout the presentation so that there is some perspective directly from the people who lived this and experienced it in the presentation. All right, let's get started. Okay, who are the Pamunkey? I start here just because, and here, what I mean by here, I assume most folks recognize these images. We've got John Smith and Pocahontas. Most people have heard of the story of Pocahontas and her saving of John Smith's life. We, of course, don't know if that was even an historical event, if that really happened. But I start here because I know most people, at least, have heard of these individuals. And how did the Pamunkey kind of fit into all of this? So, first, I just want to emphasize that our history did not begin in 1607. Indigenous peoples in this region have been here for tens of thousands of years, and quite frankly, many of us from our communities would say that we've always been here. There was no migration movement into the Americas. Our ancestors have always been here. And Jamestown, the folks who established Jamestown, right, the English, did not discover this land, right? It was already inhabited and occupied by a complex society of human beings. And I have to emphasize that because I feel like the way that our history is typically told is that it began with the English arrival, when it had been culminating and existing, again, for thousands of years prior to English colonial expansion in the region. In particular, again, where does the Pamunkey fit into this? I assume most folks have heard of the Powhatan Paramount Chiefdom. The Pamunkey, in many ways, were a political and geographic player in that chiefdom. Wahan-Seneca, also known as Powhatan, was Pamunkey. The paramount leaders that came to lead the chiefdom, and then with Wahan-Seneca, who expanded it beyond the original 5 villages that he had under his control to approximately 30 to 32 tribal communities by the time the English arrive. The folks who followed in his footsteps after his death to become the paramount leaders were all Pamunkey. And we were a matrilineal society, right, before the English introduced patriarchy. So that means that your identity and who you were, your tribal affiliation, was passed down through your mother, through the mother's line. And that's a very simple way of doing that. It gets a little complicated, but that is it in a nutshell. And again, I want to emphasize that the way that tribal folks and our communities are typically, I think, assumed to be like is something that exists in nature, right? That there is not political, social, and economic complexity within our communities. Just as the English were arriving, there was a massive, what we would call now, as anthropologists, a chiefdom being established in the landscape through trade, through intermarriage, through political diplomacy. And there were connections across the entire eastern seaboard and even into the Great Lakes in terms of trade and political networks. And so we weren't just a group of people living on the landscape. There was social, political, and economic complexity that existed, and it defined our worldview and how we responded to English colonial expansion into our lands. I'm going to fly through some of these things because I want to get to the meat of the Civil War. But the Pamunkey geographically were located in, I'm assuming most folks know where King William County is today. It is basically what we would have called Pamunkey Neck back in the day. It is flanked by the Pamunkey River to the south, the Mattaponi River to the north, and then those are the tributaries to the York. And that was kind of the heart of Pamunkey territory, again, prior to European colonial expansion. So, again, most folks don't know that the English weren't the actual first ones to arrive here. It was the Spanish. And so the Powhatan people, right, had a working knowledge of Europeans prior to the English arriving. And the English had a working knowledge of indigenous peoples, right, in the Americas before they came to what is now Virginia. So again, there's not this just unknown of two cultures coming together. Each was working with some kind of knowledge of the other. When the English established the first permanent English settlement in what is now the United States, immediately conflict erupts. And this leads to multiple years of warfare between the groups that allied with the Powhatan chiefdom, who are a part of that chiefdom, and the English. And when you have conflict and violence, that leads to treaty negotiations in order to establish peace, right? And you'll see here on the presentation, the issues that were causing the conflict, obviously unchecked expansion into our lands, which interfered with our subsistence and our trade practices, which impacts our economy. The enslavement of indigenous people, another topic that is not readily discussed. And then, which led to two major uprisings, 1622, 1644, led by Pamunkey paramount leader, Opechancanough, who took on the chiefdom soon after his brother or kin, Seneca Powhatan, died. And as I mentioned, that violence, the conflict, leads to treaty negotiations to establish peace. Treaty negotiations are key to understanding tribal history, not just here in Virginia, but across the United States. These are the documents that many tribal nations look to support and uphold our sovereignty, right? So at the same time that England was negotiating treaties with the Powhatan, they're negotiating treaties with France, for example. So I want to bring home the reality that our people were nations. We had our own forms of self-governance, right? And the documents that were produced through the treaty negotiations were the cornerstones for us being able to, as best we could during these times, protect our rights. And they're still used today. Again, they're the cornerstone of ensuring that when those rights are encroached upon, which they still are to this day, we have these documents to look to demonstrate to Virginia, to the United States government, we have an agreement, and that needs to be upheld. But of course, I assume most folks know that all treaties have been broken. But that doesn't negate the fact that they are still important documents to indigenous peoples. I just want to briefly mention here there are multiple treaty negotiations that are happening in colonial Virginia throughout the 17th century. I'm just going to mention the two large ones because of the impact that they had on the Indian community in Virginia. So you have the Treaty of Peace with Nicotiwants, 1646. Nicotiwants is the paramount leader, also a Pamunkey individual, who takes on the chiefdom after Opechancanough is murdered in 1644. With the follow-up of that uprising, the Treaty of Middle Plantation, 1677, again following a major conflict uprising in the colony that was led by Nathaniel Bacon. So the 1677 treaty is really kind of a rehashing and reestablishment of the 1646 treaty. And it did a lot, but the key things that I want to highlight here, so tributaries to the English crown. What does that mean? Okay, we are recognizing that you are a sovereign within this land, and we are going to take our system, which was very much a tributary-based system that I won't get into now because I could talk to you about that for hours, but that we would be tributary to the English crown. We're going to recognize the power dynamic in this negotiated treaty, right? Importantly, it establishes boundaries between English and Indian territory, right? This is the precursor to the reservation system in what becomes the United States. Virginia has some of the earliest treaties negotiated with indigenous communities. It also has the oldest continually occupied reservations with the Pamunkey Reservation and the Mattaponi Reservation that are still occupied. and govern today here in Virginia, and they're located in King William County, which was historically, through these treaty negotiations, Indian territory. And what that did was it took the indigenous communities that were allied to the Powhatan chiefdom, for example, the Chickahominy, who came on later to ally with the chiefdom, the Rappahannock, these folks who were maybe historically located in Pamunkey Neck or King William County, but moved and forced indigenous people to kind of congregate into what was defined as Indian territory. And if you were an indigenous person during this time and you needed to walk out, literally cross the boundary, you could not do that safely. And so in order to do that safely, the treaty stipulated that indigenous messengers, indigenous people, would have to wear special things on their bodies to show that they were friendly tributary Indians, right? That they had negotiated and been a part of agreements with England. So that's where you get the badges, a coat of striped stuff, which basically means a striped wool coat that was garish, so that it would, they could see that, okay, this is not a normal person. This is somebody who is signifying themselves as an indigenous person who needs to cross out of Indian land and into non-Indian land. This is important because this is setting the stage for how not just indigenous people are going to be treated in the colony of Virginia, but all people of color, right? These are the precursors to past laws that come about later when we get to the Civil War, right before the Civil War period, that if you're going to safely travel as a free person of color, you need certain things on your bodies, like, for example, papers. Or in earlier times, these objects or these types of clothing in order to pass safely through the landscape. It established the annual treaty tribute to the governor. So in lieu of taxes, the indigenous communities that were signatory to the treaties were required to basically pay that tribute, right, to the governor of Virginia, who was the proxy of the King of England at that time. This is a practice that we still do today, right? And I get a lot of questions, well, why do they make you do that? They don't make us do that. We do that because it is a reminder to the Commonwealth, right, and now the United States with 7 newly federally recognized tribes here in Virginia, that they have an agreement with us and that we expect them to respect and uphold that agreement. It's a reminder, right, of that responsibility, of that trust responsibility to indigenous communities. Lastly, protections against enslavement. I think a lot of folks have a hard time wrapping their heads around the fact that indigenous people were enslaved right at the get-go. They were a part of the enslaved economy in colonial America and then into when the United States was established. And treaty stipulations, for example, about protections against enslavement exist because enslavement existed. So there were articles in both of those treaties stating that, okay, if you're friendly, if you're tributary, we won't enslave your children. And one of the major reasons for enslavement of indigenous peoples in Virginia, at least, was to pay for the war against them. So a lot of our ancestors were wrapped up as prisoners of wars and shipped down to colonies, British colonies, for example, in the West Indies. And quite interestingly enough, we get a lot of folks that have come up when I used to work at our museum on a reservation who are like, I can trace my ancestry back to here. My ancestors were enslaved as indigenous people and sent down to Barbados or, the Caribbean. So there's this, this big economic connection of the enslavement of indigenous people as well. Okay. And again, this is setting the stage, right? Fear of enslavement, not being able to cross the landscape safely. 18th century Pamunkey, they are continuing tribal self-governance. This is something that we have never not had within our community. Because we have land, because we have a reservation, we've always had a government that has existed. The way that that government has been formed and the way that it operates has changed over time, of course, but we continue self-governance and even until this day. 18th century, Queen Anne, she is the last hereditary chief of the Pamunkey, again, following that matriline. After that, and she's also the last woman to sit in Pamunkey Council as a leader up until very recently. So my mom was actually the first woman to sit on tribal council since Queen Anne. So she's in the audience. The Bradfordton Indian School, boarding schools were a colonial thing, right? This isn't something that the United States just created. The United States is based off of British Indian policy. Boarding schools is a part of that. Harvard had the first one, William and Mary, and Williamsburg had the second. And many Pamunkey Indian children, as well as other Virginia Indian communities, sent their boys to this school for about a 7-decade period. Interestingly enough, this is also, it had a big part to play in the adoption of Christianity. That was kind of the force behind the Bradfordton. It was about proselytizing Indigenous people so that they could learn Christianity and then bring it back to their communities. And in some ways, that was successful. It did introduce Christianity. Pamunkey folks, as well as other Virginia Indian communities, did adopt Christianity into the 18th century. And just to mention a couple of folks here too, many of the students that attended the Bradfordton were a part of that kind of like revolutionary like fervor, right, that comes out of Williamsburg. The Indigenous students aren't immune to that, right? They're a part of that Williamsburg community. And several of them actually joined the American Revolution to support the Patriots, not the British. And some of those individuals are Robert Marsh and George Sampson. And I'll be writing up some information on them, hopefully sooner rather than later, to be published on Encyclopedia of Virginia. So their stories will be out there, more publicly, hopefully in the near future. All right, let's get into the 19th century. Bear with me, guys. I promise this all matters to the Civil War. Because here we are, again, we're setting the stage. So we have social, political, and economic influences that all kind of culminate in the Pamunkey's decision as a tribal nation, right? It's a concerted decision to support the Union. And I'm going to go over some of those different examples. So by the 1820s, this is what is left of the Pamunkey Reservation. It's a marshland peninsula adjacent to King William County that is juts into the Pamunkey River. It's about 1,200 to 1,600 acres. So that is what exists of at least Pamunkey Indian Territory by the time the 19th century rolls around. That's all that we've got left. And it's often referred to during this time as Indian Town or Indian Island. So you'll see references to Indian Island throughout the presentation. Pamunkey men in particular had economic connections to folks in the north. One of the markets, or the many markets that Pamunkey men engaged in throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th century included fishing, trapping for furs. I have like commission markets here, different other type of game that they would sell up and down the East Coast, all the way up to Boston, right? And as far south as Florida. They also followed the different fish runs, right? The fish that would, in particular shad and herring, that would make their way up for their spawning grounds from Florida all the way up to Boston, to Massachusetts. And so a lot of Pamunkey men were working out of these ports, these northern ports. And they included Washington, D.C., Maryland, Pennsylvania, I mentioned Boston, but also New York City as well. All right, and as I kind of started to get into, at this time, Indigenous people were also experiencing restricted rights and movement, right? Them having the ability to move across the landscape was restricted. That was due to, again, fear of enslavement. This is something that did not leave the community. I mentioned the Brafferton. The Pamunkey only agreed to send their children to the Brafferton after they were assured that their children that they did send would not be then taken and sold into slavery. Okay, so this is a reality for Indigenous people. And due to threats to their tributary status, right? The fact that they have the signatory relationship with the colony, and then the Commonwealth of Virginia when that gets established, and then threats to the reservation lands. And I'm going to get into what some of those examples look like in particular. So in 1836 and 1843, and this is not far after Nat Turner's rebellion, which lit a fire under white-owning slave families and communities across the state, quite frankly across the South, that pushed white leaders within these states to create much more stricter laws governing, again, the rights and movement of people of color during this time. And so it's no surprise that in 1836, 1843, that the surrounding families, right, of the Pamunkey Reservation, they're white, they're slave-owning, see the Pamunkey community as a threat. And that is because they're a free community of color. That in of itself is a threat, right? There was intermarriage with the enslaved community in the county. There was intermarriage with the free African American community, and also intermarriage with white folks, and that was seen as a threat to basically the white supremacist sentiments of the time. The purpose of these petitions that were given to basically Virginia leaders to say that we have this group of free people of color, they're a threat, they need to be moved, they need to be getting rid of. The purpose for that is because they don't believe that Pamunkey are Indians anymore, right? There's this perception of blood quantum that comes out of English colonial expansion. And it's a way to basically deny people the right to identify, right, as Indigenous people. And you have the rule, for example, of hypodescent that's established, where if you do have intermarriage with the African American community, you have one African American ancestor, that's the one drop rule, then you are no longer considered to be anything other than that at this time. And again, as I said, that is seen as a threat. And so the argument is that they're not Indians anymore, they're not authentic Indians, and so therefore, they no longer should have their tributary rights under the treaties. And you need to terminate their tribal status, and you need to allot the reservation lands so that white folks can buy them and get rid of, these so-called Indians. So this is the kind of context, environment, social environment that Pamunkey people are faced with prior to the Civil War. And successfully, they fought against these petitions. Other communities were not so successful. The Gingaskin or Gingaskin community on the Eastern Shore, their reservation community was allotted due to these same sentiments, as were the Nottoway reservations, located Southampton County here in Virginia, were allotted because of these same sentiments. If you wanted to travel safely, again, throughout the state, you were required to carry free papers. Indigenous people were required to do this as well. So for Pamunkey in particular, I've got an excerpt right here of free papers from tribal member Lavinia Sampson, who moved from the reservation to Petersburg. And in order to basically provide an extra level, right, of protection, she had her free papers. They were established by the tribal trustees, which was a group of basically appointed white men that helped the tribe handle its affairs. This was a practice that began in the middle of the 18th century. And so these free papers were written up and signed off by the trustees, right? You have white men to kind of prove this woman's identity. And because she was moving outside of King William did not require Indian people to register. That's another folks I think don't know about. If you were a person of color, a free person of color, prior to the Civil War, you were required to register literally for a list that described what you looked like in order for, again, there to be proof that you were considered a free person. And in many cases, the papers and the registers didn't stop folks from enslaving people of color, Indigenous people, African American people. Sometimes those things didn't work. So if you were living outside of King William County as a Pamunkey person, you would want to register for these on the free Negro mulatto registers, because it was a perceived extra level of protection to prove that you were free, a free person of color. Indigenous people were denied the right to bear arms. They were denied the right to associate freely. That's why they could not have a church of their own until after the Civil War. There were attempts that were made prior to the Civil War to establish their own congregation on the reservation, and they were denied. And so the majority of Pamunkey people went to a triracial church, again, because African American people could not associate freely. So Lower College or Colossae Baptist Church, which is still a church today in King William, that was the predominant congregation that Pamunkey people were a part of prior to the Civil War. All right. So the war begins. April 1861, Virginia secedes from the Union, and by May of 1861, there is a pro-Union restored government of Virginia that is established with a governor, Francis Pierpont. And I don't know if I'm saying his name correctly, but that's how I'm going to go with it. So the Pamunkey community, as the crow flies, is 25 miles from Richmond, where we stand today, which was, of course, the Confederate capital. And as I mentioned, they're surrounded by white slave-owning families that see them as a threat. So the tribal council, the tribal leaders at the time, decide to go to the pro-union government and get advice and go to their trustees as well. Remember that those group of white men that helps, manage the affairs for the tribes. And they were told that they needed to stay out of it. And the tribe decided that that wasn't what they were going to do. And in many ways, it was because they didn't have a choice. The war literally came to the banks of the Pamunkey Reservation, and I'll get into some of the details of that. So they decide, again, as a tribal community, as a nation, to support the Union. They feel that it's necessary for their safety. You'll see some of the quotes here about, again, worrying that if the Confederacy were to win this war, that they would be enslaved, that their rights would be further stripped, and that their lands would be taken away from them. So it was a necessary decision for them, and it was a dangerous one. Okay. So the Pamunkey River, throughout the Civil War, was a major hub of war activity. It was a major thoroughfare for supplies, as well as the movement of people, of course. And so there were 3 major Union encampments on and around the reservation from 1862 to the end of the war in 1865. And they included, as I mentioned, the reservation, White House, which is the plantation that is located across the river from the southwest bank of the Pamunkey Reservation. This picture here shows White House. The soldiers here are on the actual property of White House Plantation, and then the reservation, you can see, is in the background there. The other place where folks were located is Cumberland, which was another plantation, just downriver from the reservation, just a couple of miles of that as the crow flies. Okay. So McClellan, let's see. Hold on, sorry guys. Okay. George McClellan, who was the leader of the Army of the Potomac in 1862, set up station at White House and at Cumberland. And as I mentioned, White House is right across from the reservation. And it was a part of his Peninsula Campaign in 1862 to capture the capital of Richmond, the Confederate capital of Richmond. And this is where the Pamunkey first become engaged with the Union. And ironically, it's through Pamunkey men fishing in the river, right? Which was a huge, again, economic activity for the men at the time. Union soldiers saw these men fishing, netting for shad, and asked if they could help them, get them some food. And that's where the conversations officially started to where McClellan recruited Pamunkey people to come and Pamunkey men to come and join his efforts on the siege against Richmond. So in all, in 1862, approximately 14 Pamunkey men joined McClellan's army, and they served as guides, as scouts, spies, gunboat pilots. Again, a lot of this is because of their knowledge of the waterways. As I mentioned, they're traveling up and down the seaboard. They're doing that through the waterways. It is their intimate knowledge, right, their indigenous knowledge of the landscape that makes them so valuable to the Union. I want to hone in on just one in particular because he is the most storied and he is the only one that survives by the time that the Southern Claims Commission is doing these interviews that I had mentioned. So Terrell Bradby, quite a character, I will say. I would probably be afraid of him if I knew him back in the 1860s. For example, there's an infamous situation of him being accused of murdering his brother, that were both in the Navy, and he was acquitted. But his service began May 1862 under George McClellan. In particular for the Peninsula Campaign, he was a land guide and scout, served and fought in the 7 Days Battle. He was a spy after that for the Union Intelligence Service that was led by Alan Pinkerton. This is the precursor to the U.S., I'm forgetting the name of it. Somebody help me. Secret Service. Thank you. So that's pretty interesting. And then after his stint as a spy for the Union, he served as a second-class pilot for a gunboat, Meredith Briggs, which was a part of the James River Flotilla fleet. He also infamously escaped Confederate capture, and I will get into that in a little bit. All right. So I think Terrell's example provides kind of, again, a snapshot of what Pamunkey Union soldiers were experiencing and doing throughout the war. But it wasn't just folks that were directly involved in the action, right, that participated and provided support to the Union. The folks who were still living on the reservation, the women, the children, and the men that couldn't enlist, also did things to support the Union cause, in particular the encampments, those three major encampments that I mentioned that were on or either near the reservation. And they provided material and physical support to the Union. They allowed their property to be conscripted. Not that they really had much choice, but they didn't put up a resistance, I'll say. And when I say conscripted, basically the Union took their property. It was because they needed fuel, they needed food. And so the Union did that, as did the Confederate Army as well. And again, as I mentioned, they provided knowledge of the tidewater landscape, the riverine landscape that we all know so well here in the state of Virginia, as intelligence to the Union. Again, I want to highlight one person in particular here, Caroline Bradby Cook. She was a resident on the reservation. She also happens to be my great-great-great-grandmother. She was widowed at the start of the war in 1861 with a baby. and she witnessed the treatment of her community at the hands of the Confederate soldiers. As I'll get into more detail in a moment, the Confederates did invade the reservation. And she and the other women, again, who were not enlisted, right, they couldn't be, who witnessed all of this, further, embedded the sentiment of, we're gonna support the Union, we're not gonna stand for this. So she hosted several Union soldiers on her allotment on the reservation, on her property. In particular, the one that did come and encamp on her property was General Dix's encampment in 1863. Again, allowed her property to be conscripted. She cooked and cleaned for the soldiers, and as I mentioned, shared her knowledge of the local landscape with the Union so that they could travel on following their encampment on the reservation. All right, this is an interesting story. So, they also housed and supported Union prisoners of war, right, who had escaped Confederate capture. One of the most infamous examples of that is the escape from Libby Prison. Libby Prison, again, located in the capital, the Confederate capital of Richmond. It was the largest prison break during the Civil War. About 109 men, Union, again, were able to dig a tunnel from the kitchen to the basement and escape from the prison. About half of those men were immediately recaptured, but half of them made it out. And 2 of them actually made their way to the property of tribal member Frank Sweat. He did not live on the reservation, but lived immediately adjacent to it. So he was on the Pamunkey River, right next to the reservation, and he helped these 2 escaped prisoners. He sheltered them for a week, he fed them, he provided his only boat for them to escape to Yorktown, to the Union lines there. And again, he provided his intelligence and his indigenous knowledge of the waterways so that they could get to Yorktown in a safe manner. As you can imagine, the Pamunkey support of the Union did not go unnoticed, especially given their close proximity to the capital. So after McClellan's failed Peninsula Campaign, the 14 men that had joined that campaign returned to the reservation before they took on their next, basically, role as enlisted soldiers. And the Confederate Army, a group of folks, did invade the reservation, in particular to capture these, what they call traitorous Union sympathizers, these 14 Pamunkey men. The purpose was to take them and imprison them at Castle Thunder, which was another infamous Civil War prison located in Richmond. One person escapes, Terrell Bradby, and he details his escape in his Southern Claims Commission interviews, where he's like, I slipped off my boot, I hid in the culvert, and I was able to pretend that I had been injured because they did shoot after him, and they left him, and then he said within a week he was back on the river on a gunboat supporting the Union on the James River. We even have tribal oral history about this story. We had some oral histories that were conducted in the 1980s with our elders for federal recognition efforts, and several of the older folks remember hearing about this escape story of Terrell Bradby, which I find absolutely fascinating. All right, so imprisonment at Castle Thunder. Most of the men that were captured ended up in this prison. They were sent to their death, right? This was not a place where you were gonna be expecting to get out of alive, okay? So I can't imagine what they must have been thinking, being basically captured and forced to be imprisoned in a place like this. They were held at, I think, for about 7 weeks, along with other, folks who had been convicted as traitors to the Confederacy, spies, Union spies, and political prisoners of the Union. But they end up becoming pardoned and released for the fact that they are non-citizen Indians. And what I mean by this is Indigenous people prior to 1924 were not citizens of the United States. And it's actually clearly laid out in the Constitution that Indigenous people were not to be considered citizens. And it took an act, right, of Congress, the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, to provide widespread citizenship to Indigenous people here in the United States. That didn't mean that Indigenous people could not become citizens. There were pathways to citizenship. But for the majority of it, if you were living within your tribal community on a reservation, you were going to be considered a non-citizen Indian. And what that means is that the Union or the Confederacy has no right to force you, right, to join the Army, to, I think I've skipped one of the bullets earlier, to be pressed into service, right, be pressed into forced labor, to go work on Confederate, military installments. So the fact that they are Indigenous people is what ultimately, and that they're not considered citizens, right, is why they are able to be pardoned from Castle Thunder and also be pardoned from press to service with the Confederacy. Okay, so the war comes to an end. April 1865, you have the fall of Richmond. You've got General Lee surrendering, and you also have the assassination of President Lincoln. Like many families during this time, not all of the men made it home. Several of the men, not all of them, but the majority of the men that served the Union did not make it back to Indian Island. And then by the time that the Southern Claims Commission gets established, which I'll talk about in a moment, the only surviving veteran was Terrell Bradby at that time. So, when the Union encamped on people's property, right, whether that be the Pamunkey Reservation or anybody else's, they took that property. They gave promises and assurances to those people that the Union, right, when they succeeded, they would pay for those damages. They would pay for that taken property. And they were true to their word. The Union was true to its word. It established the Southern Claims Commission in 1871 for folks who had their property taken to file claim, right, so that they could get compensated, reimbursed for the property that was taken by the Union during the war. This was not an easy process. If you go and you read the transcripts, right, of these interviews, they're being interrogated. And the reason why they're being interrogated is because in order for your claim to be allowed, you had to prove your loyalty to the Union. And that didn't mean just one interview with the person wanting the claim. They interviewed family members, witnesses, all of these other folks that would have, in some way, shape, or form, seen the conscription of property taking place. So only around 30% of all Southern Claims Commission claims were allowed, right, in terms of the entirety of the folks who did make claims. But for the Pamunkey, all of those claims, let's see, I forget how many we had in total. I want to say we had 30 to 40 claims in total. Out of those, 86% were allowed and were paid. Usually at a reduced price, but still paid. And again, that just shows that it was very easy, right, for the Pamunkey community and for Pamunkey people to show that they had indeed very much been loyal to the Union through their service as soldiers and through their ability to support the encampments and the Union's, traversing of the landscape during the war. Interestingly enough, several of the men who did get paid through their claim established a joint stock company, and they opened a general merchandise store on the reservation. And this is where Pamunkey people could sell their surplus produce, their fish, their furs, their games. Again, another way to help them make money during a very difficult time. As you can imagine, immediately following the war, even a decade, well, not quite a decade later, folks were struggling. It had devastated as you know, the Southern economy, and Indigenous people were no different. Because I don't want to just end on that. I do want to just give some highlights on the fact that just like all communities, right, Pamunkey kind of picked themselves up. They continue to move forward. I want to highlight the work that tribal members and tribal council did during that time to really pursue the rights that were open and available to them at that time, right? So they were able to get their Baptist congregation established. That happened in 1866. Terrell Bradby, he also became chief, so, which I'm not surprised. He seemed like the type of person that would have been able to successfully, in some way, shape, or form, lead a community after what he had gone through. They established the church. We had Indigenous Baptist preachers, reverends, that served in the church. We were admitted into the Dover Baptist Association, but could not talk at the meetings until about 20 years later. We were not allowed to talk as people of color. And, you know, they're pursuing education for their young folks. 1870s, the state establishes the public education system, and the tribe gets right on, leadership gets right on trying to petition the state to support a reservation-based school. It doesn't happen until 1882, but it happens. And, you know, secondary education is not made available to Indigenous students until the 1950s, late 1950s and early 1960s. Which meant Indigenous folks didn't get education, right, beyond the 7th or 8th grade, and then had to be shipped to boarding schools across the United States in order to get that secondary education. But that is another story for another time. There's so much I could talk about, so many nuggets of information and you know, amazing rabbit holes that we could go down to really kind of, again, get at the deep history and complex history of Indigenous people here in Virginia. So I'm really giving you the tip of the iceberg here. But, you know, just to say my thank yous to Library of Virginia for having the opportunity to come and share this history with you. Of course, my tribal community who has supported the work that my business partner, Michelle Keel, have done on the Civil War history with the tribe. And I guess, again, thank you to all of you for coming and being willing to listen and to learn. I appreciate it. So thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Spivey. We have a couple of minutes for questions, so if you're interested, please line up at either mic, and we will probably take 2 to 3.
Was the Reverend Langston Pamunkey, or was
Yes.
he? Yeah.
Yes, we had a long history of Pamunkey folks who were, you know, served the community through the church. So yes, he was definitely Pamunkey.
I'm curious about the economy before the British came, so what did they have besides, you know, afterwards they needed money, so what did they use before that?
So that's a great question, and this is what my dissertation is on, and I would recommend everybody go and read that if you're bored. But so before that, again, it was an economy that was based off of knowledge of the landscape, right? Through generations upon generations of building that knowledge and understanding what was edible, what wasn't. They did that through hunting, fishing, gathering, and horticulture, and then also through trade, right? I mentioned there were quite extensive trade networks that were established throughout, again, the eastern seaboard and up into the Great Lakes region, so through trade and things like that. And this knowledge, right, this intimate knowledge, Indigenous knowledge of the landscape, especially the waterways, did not stop when the English arrived, right? We struggled because we didn't have the same level of access to that landscape, but that knowledge didn't go away. And so when the English come in, they introduce a market economy, right, that then morphs into what we know now as a capitalist economy, where you need cash, money to survive. They built a dual economy that was based off of Indigenous knowledge. That knowledge was then incorporated and used to engage the markets, right? Fish, fur, to name just two. to make money. So it was, in many ways, having that market connection and the market drive kept those traditions alive. So it's kind of this interesting feedback loop. It's continuity through change, right? That I don't think people really understand very much exists in the indigenous communities. And some of that economy still, exists today. And they did seasonal work, labor. When they weren't fishing or hunting or trapping for fur, they were working in places like Richmond or Petersburg to make money. All right. Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
I'm actually a Native American as well, and I sincerely appreciate your dedication and the thoroughness of your information. My question, a very important question, what in your extensive background and education of being a Pamunkey, the tribal future, especially for the Pamunkey tribe, as essential it is here in Virginia, but also around the nation. There's so many tribes that have been, unfortunately, not well preserved or respected, or in the information that is attributed to education. What is their essential features that should be essential for the progress and the survival of the information and the ancestral history and heritage of the Pamunkey tribe, as well as the Native American indigenous people? Moving forward, how can we preserve that and make it better, and to make sure that it is an essential part of American history?
Yes, thank you so much. That's a great question, and it's a big question. And I'm going to just talk from my own personal perspective because, of course, I don't represent the Pamunkey in their entirety, and I definitely don't represent the Virginia Indian community in its entirety. But I feel that we're kind of on this precipice, right? Or not just Pamunkey, but I think a lot of our communities where we have certain folks in the community, mostly elder folks in the community, who hold a lot of this knowledge, and that can be anything from the history of governance, like the history of certain practices, like fishing, hunting, of pottery making, right? These kind of tangible things that folks can see. Self-governance, right? Land. All of these things are wrapped up into what can define an indigenous community. And I feel like we are at the space and place where the folks who experienced those things, right? Like my grandfather or my great-grandfather's generation, that knowledge is going to be going away very soon. It's already going away. It's slipping away. And so instead of just relying on the fact like, oh, we'll always have these people around to talk to, we don't live that life anymore, right? Very few of us do, at least. And so we as tribal nations and as communities have to make, in my opinion, a concerted, strategic, programmatic effort to ensure that this history and that this knowledge is not lost. Because I think about this probably on a daily basis, where it's like, what are we going to do? And Pamunkey is facing climate change impacts too with the reservation. We're probably going to have to relocate at some point in time, maybe sooner rather than later. And I don't want to think about it because it makes me very sad and upset. It makes me get emotional. But these are the types of things that we have to do as communities, and quite frankly, we need to work together. We're all interconnected and related. Our cultures and histories, yes, they're distinct, but they're so much interrelated and tied together. And so being programmatic internally, being programmatic intertribally, I think is going to be the answer. And hopefully we can do that.
I also wanted to thank you for coming today and
you.
sharing your knowledge. Is this information, your work, available in publication or on the internet?
So not yet. I have a snippet of it in the dissertation. I'm working with Library of Virginia to publish a blog on what we just talked about today. Thank you. Okay. I'm also working to publish my dissertation whenever that happens. So eventually, yes, it will be available.
Well, thank you everyone for attending, and thank you, Dr. Ashley.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.